And we're live. It is Friday, November 15th, 2024, 8 a.m. I have my cup of coffee, and you are watching Dog Shirt TV, a fucking revolution in morning television. I am back in the hammock studio. I may be hosting myself today, by myself today. I don't know. I don't know who's going to show up. It's the first day of the true experiment of Dog Shirt TV, where I don't know who's going to be co-hosting with me. I don't know if anybody's going to break in from the Greek chorus and have questions, or whether I'm just going to be vamping like this for 1 hour, which I gotta tell you is a daunting proposition. I like the sound of my voice as well as the next arrogant person does, but the idea of talking without a script for an hour straight is a little bit scary. Nobody to bounce off of, no questions. I don't know. I've never done that before, just gotten on a live stream and talked. And so this is the first day of the true experiment. Yesterday, I knew I had an Atlantic interview to do, and I knew I was going to be talking to Kate Klonick about her tech policy in the Trump administration thoughts. And I knew that Lisa Kaplan was going to show up, but she stood us up. So, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. We knew we had an hour of material. Today is the big question. So if you are in the Greek chorus, um, get ready with your comments and questions and thoughts, because this is the vitality of this project is going to depend on you guys, at least to some degree. All right, for the monologue today, let's talk about the totality of the cabinet picks, which have shaped up in a fashion that is really quite shocking. Hello, Eve Gaumond.
Good morning.
You
Work?
are, I'm sorry?
Does it work? No,
It
wait a
works.
minute.
Yeah, it sounds
Well,
like
I'm
we have
just super late.
a little bit of a delay. There's maybe a little bit of latency, and we're getting a little bit of feedback from your end. So if you just keep yourself muted when you're not
Okay, let me
talking,
2
that'll be
seconds
great.
and I'll be back with something more
And now Ev is
appropriate.
frozen, but that is okay, because I was going to start the monologue anyway. Look, the cabinet appointments had been in the Department of bad, but could be worse. I mean, is Marco Rubio my idea of an ideal Secretary of State? No. Is he my idea of the worst Trump could do on Secretary of State? No, that would have to be Rick Grinnell. And if Rick Grinnell had been announced for that position, we would all be sending him foot pics today, and we're not. And there's a bunch of positions like that. The National Security Advisor, for example, Mike Waltz, wouldn't have picked him myself. Not my kind of guy, but not the worst I could imagine either. That said, the shock and awe of the last 48 hours in appointments, which includes Mr. Hegseth first, and that was bad, putting the Defense Department in the hands of somebody who's really known principally and kind of only as a commentator who advocates for war crimes and against things like gender opportunities for women in the military. That's a really bad appointment. And This is a terrible appointment. That said, the Pentagon is so vast and so complicated that in a way that is not true of some other agencies, it can kind of run on autopilot. Not the biggest decisions, of course, but the day-to-day operation of the Defense Department has a kind of automaticity that some other agencies do not have. Um, so, can you imagine a situation in which Mr. Hegseth does the public stuff and um, is the public voice of things, does events and, goes on television, and then the Pentagon kind of runs underneath him. It's not the optimal arrangement, but it's conceivable. All right. Then you had naming, or actually before Hegseth, you had naming John Ratcliffe to be the CIA director. Now, John Ratcliffe is a, kind of apparatchik from the first Trump administration. He's really a very unattractive figure and did some bad things in the first Trump administration. That said, he does have some experience. He was the DNI. Now Eve Gaumond is upside down, which is kind of cool.
Well,
And he is, he was a U.S. attorney. He has some genuine experience. And by the way, I see that appointment as somewhat like uh, the uh, the Mike Pompeo appointment to be CIA director once upon a time. Bad, could be worse. All right, but then the shock and awe begins. We get Hegseth, then we get Tulsi Gabbard to be the DNI, and that, as I discussed yesterday, is just sort of next level weird. Then we get Matt Gaetz, and then yesterday we get RFK Jr. To be HHS secretary. And layering through all of this, of course, is the possibility that the Senate won't even get to vote on these people because the president is going to engineer recesses. So, and then use the recess appointment power. So we've got lots of stuff on the table to talk about. I did my situation column on the recess and adjournment issue yesterday. But we have Eve here, so let's find out what Eve is thinking about. Eve, where are you joining us from?
I'm from Montreal. Yeah, I'm currently in Montreal.
And how crazy do we look from the frozen far north?
I wouldn't say crazy. I think we have a fair bit of compassion for you guys, and we kind of
in a patronizing sort of way, or a this is us 2 years from now
no, in a
kind of
way. More like that. We are going to have elections in the next year, for sure. It's been a threat looming over us for a while now, and we have one candidate who, despite not being a Donald Trump, is kind of a populist and takes a fair bit of inspiration from all of what's going out down there. So it creates some anxiety here. So we definitely are not in a position to either be patronizing or just like mock you.
So let's talk about the Canadian political landscape, because I'm sure for all of our viewers and listeners who in the backs of their mind, they're thinking, well, I only live 300 miles from Canada or 35 feet from Canada in the case of some of our bordery people, or 1,500 miles from Canada if you're, in Texas or whatever. What is who are the Trumpists in the frozen far north, and how plausible are they to become the government after the next election?
So the Trumpists, so to speak, would be the Conservative Party, led by Pierre Poilievre, he's been a politician for a long time. He's been elected as since he was 28 or something like that. But he's gone through a transition after seeing what had happened, how the political landscape worldwide changed. And he kind of now portray himself as a guy who's working for the middle class, for the people. When a few years ago we had the truckers who kind of invaded the city of Ottawa and kind of paralyzed it, and the blockade of Ottawa was closely tied with pandemic, vaccine mandates, and borders crossing with the states, the closure of the border with the United States for truckers. And it was very encouraging of them. And this blockade was kind of powered by some sort of Russian
Ev, if you can hear me, I'm just going to pick up. Oh, wait, you're back. Can you hear me?
Good.
Okay, go.
Yeah. So where did I stop? So Pierre Poilievre is a guy from the Conservative Party. He's the leader of the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party has not been in power since 2016, I think. So they're kind of trying to find their way back, and they're likely to have it. There's a huge incumbent bias against Justin Trudeau, so he's on his way out, and the NDP is unlikely to get into power. It's never been had power, and it's unlikely to have it now. So we're very likely to have Pierre Poilievre as a prime minister, and he's close to truckers who invaded and blockade the city of Ottawa, powered by Russian disinformation. We have currently a scandal about foreign interference, and he refuses to have clearance to figure out who are the people in his party who have been perhaps compromised and influenced by foreign interference. So it's kind of worrisome. We're not in a position to judge you at all.
And so what is when you hear the Conservative Party's rhetoric, and I think of the Canadian Conservative Party as pretty mellow historically, but it has taken a pretty populist turn recently. What does it represent that's aberrational from the traditional old progressive Conservative Party of of my youth, when you had folks who were would have been running the Conservative Party, who would have been moderate Democrats in the United States? What does the Conservative Party today represent?
Well, first of all, the Progressive Conservative Party was kind of an exception. It's the result of a combination of several branches of the party that kind of all merged together at some point and became this party, which was led by Brian Mulroney, and which was very more moderate. But it has always been a combination of people who had never totally the same kind of views. So you have some parts of the party who are more social conservative, anti-abortion, which is kind of more controversial. It's way more controversial here. It's something that we would think as pretty much agreed upon and decided and like not movable at all. But there are a few backbenchers, member of parliaments, who are trying to bring legislation once in a while. So this is one part of the party that every leader of it has to kind of get sympathy for, and that is taking more and more traction. You have also like the middle class people, not the economic conservative, but more like eggs are like, we want to pay our eggs cheaper. So like housing and stuff like that. It's at the moment, it's really more like a party of like reaching out to all of the people who are not happy with the sort of leadership that we have with Justin Trudeau, who represents all of this elite ideals.
So it's very similar, really, in tone to I mean, you have a liberal government that is like the Democratic Party, understood rightly or wrongly to be the party of elites, and you have the conservatives are a kind of anti-elite populist coalition of sort of discontented, angry and mostly working class folks, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I guess you have, and it's probably similar to the States, you have also the people who just like don't want to pay taxes, like the corporation and stuff, that will never imagine themselves voting for a more left-wing party. And this is a base that still powers the party as well. So but other than that, yeah, you're right.
But that's a very similar effect to here as well, right? The Trumpist coalition is a coalition of working class people and billionaires.
Correct. Yeah.
So, all right, how does Quebec fit into this? Because in Canada, in the United States, you have a left-right split. But you also have in Canada, layered on top of that, a nationalist federalist split that is kind of true in every province, but really true in Quebec. And you have in some ways a great deal more provincial autonomy than we have state autonomy in the United States. In some ways not, particularly in the criminal law space. But what does a Canadian Trumpist movement look like layered on top of traditional Francophone, Anglophone tensions?
Well, so all over the country, you have premiers that are more or less aligned with this populist movement. So you have the Rob Ford of this world. In Alberta, we have a premier who's pushing forward anti-trans.
Rob Ford, for those who don't know, is the premier of Ontario, and you might remember, or his he's part of
Doug is the premier.
Doug is the premier. His brother was the mayor of Toronto, where he smoked crack. He's the Marion Barry / Donald Trump of Canada.
Yeah. So Alberta, we have a premier who's pushing anti-trans laws. British Columbia has recently gone through elections, and they were very close, like very, very, very close. And that would be interesting, actually. We had to wait several days to know who would be premier of British Columbia between the Conservative Party and the more traditional elite, like the NDP. And there were like vote countings and stuff like that. And it turned out super well. Still, it's interesting to see how, and they just had passed some regulations for like anti-disinformation, and like denying big lies, stuff like that. So all over the country, all over Anglo-Canada, we have populism rising. it is also rising in Quebec, but in a different way. So all of these premiers are very, they tend to use way more than before the non-withstanding clause that allow governments to pass law going against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it's
Wait,
and we
so
have
let me
same
explain
here.
this to people who might not know what the Charter is or the notwithstanding clause. So the Charter is the Canadian equivalent of the Bill of Rights. And unlike the Bill of Rights, the Canadian Constitution has what's called a notwithstanding clause, which allows provinces, which traditionally is really only Quebec that uses it. But as Eve is saying, more recently, a bunch of other provinces have gotten in on the action. And the notwithstanding clause says basically, if a province wants to do something that violates the Charter, or that may violate the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and it really, really wants to do it, it passes it under the so-called notwithstanding clause, which is basically a sort of fuck you exception to the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Is that a fair characterization, other than the verbiage?
It is. But so you have, when you're using the notwithstanding clause, you have like to mention, okay, I know that what I'm doing now is kind of going against the Charter. I'll do it anyway. I'll do it anyway. So it's supposed to have like an impact on perception, and you only have it for 5 years. You have to do it over and over again every 5 years. Hey, Antti, how's it going? But yeah.
So, Antti,
Fair.
you are the floor is yours to interrupt Eve from Finland. Finland interrupting Canada through Washington. Go for it.
Very rudely. So my apologies. So I was actually curious about what do you think about Canadian support for Ukraine?
Truth is that I have not paid.
Great question. Do the populists in Canada have a pro-Russian lilt the way the ones in the United States do?
Truth is that I haven't paid sufficient attention to it, but like Canada has a huge Ukrainian immigrant population, so I think it might like help a bit with that, because like if you have a Ukrainian neighbor that is nice and has been there for a long time, it kind of help. But I still think that we have all of this discourse of like, we're not helping our people. Why are we helping people 67 miles away in Ukraine? Like, let's focus on our people and not engage in wars that are not ours. But I don't think it's as prevalent as it is in the States. But I say that with all sort of caveats, and I'm not sure of what I'm saying.
All right, so let's go back to Quebec. How does populism in layer, what does the Quebecer populist movement look like, and how is it different from the Anglophone populists?
Okay, so now that I've said that all over the country we have premiers that are using the notwithstanding clause and kind of in line with populist movement, we have François Legault from the CAQ, who's the premier of Quebec. And
what
he was
is
like,
the CAQ?
Sorry, it's the Coalition Avenir Quebec. So the Coalition for the Future of Quebec. It's a party that was created more or less 10 years ago as a kind of big tent that would rally people from all walks of life. So traditionally you had the Liberal Party and the PQ, the Parti Québécois, who were going on alternating for power. And it was always in a kind of like, are we sovereignist? Are we Canadian? And it was a kind of battle, perpetual battle. And they were like, okay, let's stop with this and just move forwards with governing properly. And let's not talk about sovereignty anymore. We'll be nationalists. We'll advocate for the objectives and values of Quebec, but not in a way of like, we're just like trying to be defender the right and interest. It's kind of like a Bloc Québécois, so which is it's like advocating for the rights of Quebec in Canada, but like without breaking the federation. So this was their point. So they created their Big Tent movement 10 years ago, and they got elected right before the pandemic. And they are right wing. Turned out they are very nationalist, very protection of French, anti-immigrants. So the premier of Quebec, which is François Legault, who's leading the CAQ, would kill me if he hear me say this. But the truth is that he's very much like all of the other premiers all over the country, but except that he's speaking French and that he's he's promoting the same kind of argument, but pretending to be defending the interest of Quebec and pretending that Quebec is very different from all of the rest of Canada, which under his leadership, it's not clear it is.
So is your assumption that a year from now, there will be a populist Canadian government that will look at the federal level, that will look something like the the Doug Ford slash CAC slash Alberta premiers, or is it going to be more like everything in Canada is a little bit softer than here, right? And so you have the sort of hard-edged provincial level, but then at the federal level, Canada's nice in a way that we're not. And so you don't get the Rob Fords at the federal level. You get Brian Mulroney at the federal level, or Stephen Harper at the federal level, and that there's something that smooths that out, and it looks, horrifying to liberal voters in Canada, but it looks pretty mild from an American perspective. Which are we talking about?
I would go in with a response that is kind of in between. I think that at the end of the day, it will look mild for American voters. But not because what they're doing at the moment, not because the Polyev rhetoric is mild, but because his whole rhetoric is, I think, a way of getting elected. And I think that if he ends up in power at the end of the day, he's not a dumb guy. Everyone who has kind of worked with him in the past says that he's smart, he knows what he's doing, is used to power. So I think that he's doing all of this stuff to get elected. He knows that it's what's working, and all of the previous leaders of the party that were more moderate, more like traditional Canadian conservative party, failed to beat Justin Trudeau. So he's trying to take the American way. But when he's elected, I'm not sure he will maintain this position.
So he's basically like a Canadian J.D. Vance. He used to be a sensible person. Yeah. He discovered it wasn't working for him. He decided to be a crazy person instead. But we assume that not a bit of it is sincere and that it's entirely tactical.
Absolutely. It is absolutely correct.
All right. There is, in half an hour, completely without pre-planning. I literally texted Eve this morning at 7:59, come co-host with me so I'm not lonely, and good morning. And actually, I believe there was a typo, and so it says come co-host with me so I'm not lovely, and good morning. That was neither an attempt to harass Ev, nor was it intentional, and I only noticed it just now. But Ev showed up and gave you all an incredible lesson in the forthcoming Canadian populist movement at both the provincial and federal levels. This is what this is all about. Antti, you are still here, which I can only assume means you have more to say. The floor is yours. Because Antti knows the rules. He knows them intuitively. He knows that when he's done having something to say, he's going to dismiss himself. And since he hasn't dismissed himself under the common law of Dog Shirt TV, I assume he has more to say. Now, if Antti were a different person and he were just hanging out here because he wanted to be on screen, I would get annoyed at him. But I know that's not the way he operates. And so, again, we are assuming, because we are a community of people who act like we know each other, and Antti and I actually do know each other. We have met in person. But we are going to run this show as though we were a community of people who all knew each other and all respected each other. And so we don't have a button here that says, make Antti disappear, because we, first of all, we don't want to use, we do have that button, but we're not going to use it. And secondly, because we assume if Antti is still here, there's a good reason for it, to which we now defer. What's on your mind, sir?
Well, we've sort of skirted and danced around this issue and been to it in some ways, but what's your take? Because Ev, you've obviously seen American politics quite a lot, and you've seen the performative aspect that's quite prevalent, especially in the House of Representatives. So if you were to compare that with the sort of the dialogue and the goings on in the Canadian Parliament, is there, like, it's smoothed out, of course, but do you see the same sort of shall we say, unpolite rhetoric that really?
Oh yeah. And I mean, it's, in terms of performativeness, I'm not sure it's much better, and it's definitely not what you would expect from Canadians. There's no true there's no polite debate in this house. Like, they're really, the question period really is destined to have like clips that you can push on the social media afterwards. And so we have recently, I don't remember exactly the slur that Poilievre used against Justin Trudeau, but it was sufficiently harsh that the president of the House asked him to like retire what he has said, and Poilievre refused, and he has to be expulsed from the House because he refused to withdraw what he has said. And it was kind of something, now that I think about it, it might be very ridicule in the eyes of American public, but I think it might have been like weirdo or something like that. It can't be that, but maybe it was not super harsh.
But it was super harsh for Canada,
I guess.
Right.
I'll have to look at this and I'll come back to you about it. But like, but yeah, they're insulting each other's.
Yeah.
What about in Finland?
I'll drop down now.
Wait, no. When we have a Finn and we're talking about politics, we're going to get a Finland update. The Finland has a populist movement of its own. It used to be called the True Finns Now it seems to have
Yeah.
changed to the Finns party, except only in English, right? In Finland, it's still True Finns. Is
It's
that right?
still, yeah, exactly. It's still the true Finns. Yeah.
So, Antti, are you a false Finn? Are you like a fake Finn?
Well, considering the company I keep, I would say that I could be categorized as such.
Mm-hmm.
But
So tell us about
heritage-wise, no, but otherwise.
So where are we've talked to Minna Olander about this, but a while back, where do you see the populist movement in Finland now? How strong is it, and where do you see it as going in the next few years?
Wow, that's a really good question I mean, the thing is that I do follow our internal politics, but I tend to stray quite a lot to the foreign policy because there is just so much in the domestic politics that I don't have the stomach for. But I mean, it's not going to go away because there was a period a couple of years back when actually the True Finns party split up in two because there were several the sort of more normal leadership position people who wanted to stay in government, and they basically that was there was a schism and the party split in two, and now the leadership folks who split off. The party does exist, but it's tiny, like really, really tiny. So they didn't carry the rank and file with them at all. And I would say that it has like quite a few other right-wing movements. It has grown to be more radical in a way, and there is you can see the same sort of anger and hatred, not in the scale and the level that's in the United States and in some other countries, but you can see the same sort of aspect to it in Finland too, and that worries me.
And who
And
is it
I
directed
also, yeah.
against?
Well, one of the big, I suppose, driving forces in the party is hostility to immigration, which might seem totally foreign to you, right?
Yeah, although the
Yeah.
valence of European anti-immigrant sentiment and US anti-immigrant sentiment, I think, are quite different.
Yeah.
You know, because despite what Stephen Miller thinks, the United States is not an ethno-state, right? And there's no such thing, in a way that only Canadians and Australians really understand. There's no such thing as a American in an ethnic or national sense, only in a civic national sense. And so, when European countries have anxieties about immigration, they're thinking about what it means to be Finnish. They're thinking about, will people learn the language? They're thinking about whether there's some ethnic core to Finland that, gets disrupted if a whole lot of Syrians or Iraqis or North Africans show up.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the United States has a very deep comfort level with the idea that lots of people come here and move here. Although that comfort level does ebb and flow, the anxiety here arises from, first, the failure to have an orderly process for it, the sort of legal versus illegal nature of immigration. But secondly, what happens when large numbers of migrants, legal or not, suddenly show up in an uncontrolled way in communities that then have to respond. And some of that is simple racism, a la what J.D. Vance and Donald Trump did with respect to Haitians in Springfield, Illinois. But some of it is, actually legitimate sense of resource being flooded and social services being flooded. And so you see even very blue cities getting anxious about the number of people. And that's actually a different issue that, also has a parallel in a lot of European countries. But I do think the flavor of the constant is anti-immigrant sentiment, but the flavor of it is, I think, a bit different in the United States than in Europe.
Yeah, and there's this weird shift that occurred right after the current governing coalition came together. Is that previously in the elections, the rhetoric from the True Finns party was that yes, we are for the common people, for the poor people in the countryside, and almost immediately after the coalition began its work, it was the policies enacted, especially economic policies, was well, we need to tighten the belt like all over, and that means that we have to cut into social benefits and foreign aid. That's easy to cut into, especially if it's something not to do with Ukraine, and also like there is this same idea that you can see in the United States as well, is that you can tell if you try to follow the news and try to follow the political decisions and where the conversation is going, that actually they are in some cases making a full 180 on what they said before the election and what they are doing after the election. So it's the same thing that where the their voters are concerned, they're actually acting against their better interest. But there's also the same situation with the media environment, that it's splintered, and there's this the formation of bubbles that's occurring everywhere. And it seems that in Finland as well, there are these parallel realities. And when you're in a right-wing ecosystem, everything gets filtered through. And if you're in a left-wing one, and if you live in a big city, and if you live in the countryside,
so
you
what
have
is
all of these different
what
frameworks.
characterizes the reality of a Finnish right-wing media ecosystem that's focused on, say, the countryside? If you're living in a farm in rural Finland and you are right of center and consuming right of center media, what does your reality look like, and how is it different from what, say, an urban American might think of, or an urban Canadian might think of as reality, or an urban Finn?
Yeah, I mean, from a rural standpoint, every time, I mean, my parents are maybe a poor example, but it's still a different reality when they consume news and when I consume news, is that every time there is some bit of news that's from Helsinki or Turku or Tampere, or something to do with diversity or different cultures, or equality or racism, or anything that smacks of something that wasn't in the media eye when they were younger. Everything of that sort seems to be somehow foreign and smacking of something that's not in their own sphere of life. And then if you get into you can sort of get the hostility, and then you find the anti-immigrant sentiment there too. And then one thing that's pervasive almost throughout, with which there's common ground, is defensive policy. and in most cases foreign policy too, if you don't look into foreign aid to, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa or something like that.
Can I ask a
And
question?
just
Sure.
for people who don't know, Finland and the other Nordic countries, particularly Sweden and Norway, are huge foreign aid. This is a much larger percentage of the Finnish budget than it is of the US budget. And that's particularly, I think, true of Norway.
Yep.
Ev.
Yeah, can I? Yes. Well, we were talking about like how there's a disconnection between like rural areas and urban areas and younger people and older folks. How do we reconnect? How can we engage? And like, it's interesting. We have perspective from Finland, Canada, US, but it's all the same kind of problem. What's the strategy? How are we going to do that?
I think this is a very simplistic answer, but I think one part of the problem is that people have stopped listening to one another and respecting one another. And the civility from public discourse is moving further and further away.
And that's true
especially
even
with
in
people
Finland.
Yeah.
I think of Finns
Yeah,
as relentlessly morose and relentlessly polite. And, you know, the idea that civility is eroding in Finland, the next thing, what would the next thing be? Like Finns smiling?
Yeah, you have a point there. I mean, certainly there's a scale to things. You know, what I would call impolite and uncivil here would be, well, I'm not gonna get into what it could be in the United States.
Yeah, it would be day-to-day conversation.
Yeah, or I mean, for someone who lives in New York, I would say that the frame of reference to what's polite and what's impolite is totally different from even small town in a rural area. And I think the same. There's something about really concentrated urban areas which really brings out the extremes in people much more easily than it does in the rural areas.
Yes.
I see that John Bordeaux said, like, it's hard to reconnect with people that are not even interested in respecting the others. And I just want to clarify my question. My question is not like, how do we reconnect with Donald Trump? My question is, how do we reconnect with some of the voters that he appealed to and that are more reasonable?
I mean, look, I will just say they won, those voters, and that means they get a chance to govern. And if they govern successfully and well, then the error is on our side. And we reconnect with them by acknowledging where we were wrong and where they are right. I honestly don't anticipate that happening. But I think we have to be conceptually, in thinking about the answer to your question, you have to say, on what terms are we meeting? Are we meeting on the terms that Donald Trump makes America great again? And, you from Montreal and Antti in Finland say, wow, there's a lot we underestimated about this guy and his ideas, such as they are. And I from Washington say, wow, everything I've been thinking has been wrong. Well, then you have to approach the process of reconciliation and meeting from the point of view that of a lot of humility, that they were right about some big things, we were wrong about some big things. By the way, there's one area of national policy in the first Trump administration that I do feel that way about, which was Donald Trump put on the agenda the idea of a hard U.S. line toward China. And I think the political system has mostly coalesced around the idea that that was right. Now we argue about what that looks like in practice, and his own presentation of it, which has included kissing the ass of Xi Jinping about Uyghurs, is not something I find appealing at all. On the other hand, do I think that the bipartisan consensus of engagement with China on very gentle terms was wrong, and Donald Trump showed it was wrong? I do. And I think so. Look, there are examples where we should have the discipline to do that and say, hey, he's a bore and an asshole and a bad guy, but he actually pushed this thing in the right direction. And the flip side is, what about all the areas where the governance is awful? And I think on those issues, the basis for engagement is this what you voted for? Do you like this? And I want to have that conversation with people who voted to make America great again and are discovering that that's not something that you can flip a light switch on and do. It's a series of policies and ideas that you then have to decide if they're comfortable for you, if you believe in them, if you want that sort of thing. And so I think, but I do think the basis for discussion has to be the quality of governance.
Interesting. But like if we're building up on like Kate's point of yesterday, like don't bring facts to a feeling fight. And it kind of like the policy under Joe Biden were kind of good, right? And like economy was good, and still people were not, if I understand correctly, they didn't care. Is it more of like a policy? Is it really truly a policy discussion, or should is it something else? Is it more like, I don't feel like the economy is good?
Yeah,
whether it is in fact or no. Yeah.
Well, so I'm happy to have this conversation on the basis of feelings. So when people see large numbers of migrants rounded up and deported, I'm happy to talk on the basis of how do you feel about that. And my hypothesis is, I don't think people will look at that in practice. Some will with glee, but I think a lot of people will look at that with anxiety and upset. I think a lot of people will look at a process of tariffs in which their prices go up for a lot of things as not what they voted for. Of course, it is what they voted for, but that's a different matter. And those feelings become a basis for conversation. Look, that said, if people watch the governance and I think it is vile and they think it is wonderful, then there's very little basis for a conversation. It's not like, how do you re-engage? It's, we're looking at the same thing and we're having radically different economic or policy or moral or feelings difference to them. I don't know that I have a basis for a real conversation with somebody who reacts that way. So I think one way or another, when a democratic society votes the way we did, if you believe in democracy, you have to believe they get a chance to do what they promised voters that they were going to do, and 50% of voters voted for. I think that's just, if to not accept that at some level is to say, I want to impose my liberal views as a matter of authoritarian diktat over the will of voters. And I'm I think all you can do at that point is fall back on, hey, the majority in a democracy gets its way and has to live with the consequences. And my job is to make sure people are aware of the consequences. That's what a loyal opposition does. And am I satisfied with that? Fuck no. But I do think it's the discipline of living in a society in which in which we actually believe that the people get to govern themselves.
Well, okay, so I have a follow-up question. So your job is to ensure that the people see the policies in action. And clearly, you are in a very good position to do this. But again, how do you ensure that your message reach and feel? And how do you ensure that your message reaches these people who are often low information? Like, there are people who are not interested in the news, will switch, like they just don't want to see all politics and stuff. They just care about it to the extent that it affects their daily lives. But what's going on with the roundups of migrants, maybe they just turn off the TV because sure, it's kind of hard to witness, but you don't have to.
Yeah, so the answer is, first of all, you could start a show. And maybe there are 16 or 17 people who are on it this morning, but there were 700 people who watched it on YouTube after I posted it yesterday, and there's a bunch more who listened to it on the podcast, and some of them are in Montreal and some of them are in Finland, and so from a U.S. voter point of view, they don't count. Sorry, guys. But I mean, one thing you can do is, talk about it. Now, that does raise the question of how does your conversation extend into that world? And I have no idea what the answer to that is. But look, I am not an information messaging guy. I'm a guy with a camera and a bad internet connection, and I'm doing the best I can, and somebody is going to figure out how to puncture information bubbles, and my job is to create an environment in which there's a good conversation going on. There's a conversation where on a Friday morning you can turn it on and have no idea, and I had no idea what we were going to be talking about. We ended up having a good conversation about populism in across a number of different provinces in France and in Finland and in the United States. It is other people's jobs, particularly in Silicon Valley, to figure out some technical approaches to puncturing information bubbles. And I don't want to pretend I have the solution to that problem. My job is to convene conversations. And so I don't want to pretend to know the answer to that question, Ev. It's one of the super hard questions of our time, and it's one that is going to be solved by a combination of things, one of which is having conversations that are worth listening to, that worth participating in, that take issues seriously. Another component is how to inject that stuff into the bloodstream of larger conversations and larger information ecosystems. And I don't have a good answer to that, which is why we are coming to the end of this show. Because if I had an answer to that, I would extend the show to talk about the answer. I don't. We have 17 seconds. we're going to be back on Monday. I have no idea who will be here co-hosting with me. I have no idea what we'll be talking about, but that's the fun of it. Remember, we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have morning coffee with decent conversations. Keep the faith. In Finland, in Canada, in French Canada, and in the United States and everywhere else, y'all are great Americans, even if you're not Americans.